Hi, my name is Taryn and welcome to A British Audiophile. What is it about certain topics that gets audiophiles all riled up? Mention cables, analog versus digital, Class D amplifiers or switch mode power supplies, and you'll see veins popping all over their head. Well, welcome to another review of a Class D amplifier with a switch mode power supply, the NAD C338. Am I a glutton for punishment? Or could it possibly be that Class D amplifiers have finally reached a parity with Class AB designs? My current budget reference is the IOTA VX SA3, which happens to be a Class AB design. Let's see how this NAD stacks up. The NAD C338 is a fully featured amplifier, producing some 50 watts of power into 8 ohms and the same 50 watts into 4 ohms. I'll come to that later. It uses the highly regarded, well, in the industry at least, highly regarded Hypex UcD Class D module designed by Bruno Puzzi. He's well on his way to becoming an industry legend. And it features a inbuilt DAC, a phono stage, Bluetooth connectivity, and a streamer. Oh yes, you heard me right, a streamer as well. The unit is 435 millimeters wide, that's pretty much full width, 285 millimeters deep and 70 millimeters high. It weighs 4.85 kilograms and retails here in the UK for £599. The front panel is plastic, but it's of good quality and has a nice tactile feel. Starting from left to right, you have the power button and then a 6.25 headphone socket, the source selection buttons. The problem with that is when you're switching between sources, the visibility on the display is relatively poor. The text is very small. Next to that is a bass EQ button. You press that, you get a 6 dB of gain at low frequencies, and the volume control is smooth in operation, but you do have to make very large turns to turn the volume up just by a few dB. Taking a look at the remote control, there's an on and off button, buttons to select the source on the left hand side, and on the right hand side buttons to adjust the volume. In the middle there is a mute button, and below them there's a button to dim the display and to select the bass EQ on and off. The 3 buttons at the bottom are there to control other NAD devices. Taking a look at the rear panel, the first thing that comes to my eye are those 3 antennas sticking out. The 2 on the left are for the Wi-Fi connection, and the one on the right hand side is the Bluetooth antenna. So starting from left to right, you have 2 optical digital inputs, 2 coaxial digital inputs. The streaming and the TV are 2 line level analog inputs, and there's a connection for your turntable labeled phono in. There's also a subwoofer out should you want to connect to an external subwoofer. In the center you'll see fairly standard binding posts for the speaker connections, and on the right hand side there's an AC inlet connection and a power switch. Now, just before we get to the really interesting bit, from my perspective at least, which is to take a look at the inside, I just want to interject here for a moment. Class D amplifiers and switch mode power supplies for that matter get a very bad rap from audiophiles, and that's not without cause. There have been problems in the past. The problem is that Class D amplifiers and switch mode power supplies, by their very nature, switch components at very high frequencies, way above the audio spectrum, and that generates high frequency noise that has to be filtered out because you don't want that getting anywhere near sensitive electronic equipment. It upsets their operation. Other problems with Class D amplifiers have been that they require a large amount of feedback. That's there to linearize the response, which basically means try and get a flat frequency response, and to lower noise and distortion. Another issue has been that Class D amplifiers have had load invariance problems. Now, that's basically if your speaker load changes from 4 ohms to 8 ohms, because it's not a constant load across all frequencies. The tonality of Class D amplifiers traditionally has changed along that lines as well, and that's not a particularly desirable trait. Now, Bruno Puzzi, who invented the Hypex UcD Universal Class D module in 2003, put out a bunch of patents and it was pretty well regarded at the time that it had got round a lot of these issues. He went on to refine that design in 2008 with his N-Core amps that are very well regarded, and they've gone into higher end amplifiers from the NAD range as well as other manufacturers. He's since left Hypex and formed his own company called Purify, refined the design again, and they're finding their way into some very high end amplifiers and components. So the industry is waking up to the idea that Class D has arrived and is producing really good results, even if audiophiles aren't quite ready to wrap their arms around them just as yet. So let's take a look and see what you've got inside. On the top left-hand corner, that well-shielded section, that's the bit that deals with the functionality of your Google Chromecast, your Bluetooth and your Wi-Fi connection, hence all the shielding. Immediately to the right of that, you'll see a section with a big microchip controller. That deals with the display, functionality, general housekeeping duties inside the amplifier. Below that, you have a DAC board. That's based on the Cirrus Logic CS4382 chip. And immediately to the right of that, you have the phono preamp stage, and that's again nicely shielded. Now the right hand side has some really interesting technology that is centered around NAD's hybrid digital design and the Hypex UcD Class D module. So I'll get into that in a little bit of detail. The C338, as well as other NAD amplifiers higher up the range, incorporates their hybrid digital technology. Now that's an evolution of direct digital amps of the past, but it now incorporates Bluetooth and Google Chromecast as well. And essentially what you have is a power drive section that's used in conjunction with a balanced preamp stage to drive the Hypex UcD output module. Now I'll just briefly explain what the power drive section is. It's quite clever. Essentially it adjusts the power supply to suit the speaker. It senses voltage, current and temperature at the output stage. It switches the supply voltage to a higher winding as the impedance increases. Now according to NAD, this is basically giving you better bang for your buck, and it's the reason why it produces 50 watts into 8 ohms as well as 50 watts into 4 ohms. Now essentially what's happening here is that the incoming PCM signal, PCM stands for pulse code modulation, and that's the way the majority of digital files are encoded, DSD excluded of course. That's converted to something called PWM, pulse width modulation. Now pulse width modulation is a way of controlling the output voltage, and it's done by chopping the signal into little chunks at very high frequencies and then varying the amount of time it's on or off, high or low if you like, and that is used to get the desired output voltage. That signal is then used to drive a self-oscillating analog Class D amplifier, and that's where you get the hybrid digital name. Now don't worry if you didn't get that, many won't. All it really means is that's how they got around some of the inherent problems associated with a Class D design. Before I go on to talking about sound quality, I do want to talk a little bit about the inbuilt Google Chromecast feature. It is an important feature and worth mentioning. What you do is you download the Google Home app either on your iOS or Android device. The process is slightly different depending on what operating system you have, but it's fairly straightforward in both cases. You need to select your Wi-Fi and then add the amplifier onto that network. And once you've done, you're able to stream to the amplifier from your phone, computer or tablet in 24-bit up to 192 kilohertz resolution. That's well in excess of CD Redbook quality. And it's quite different to Bluetooth in this respect. Of course, much higher resolution, but it's the amplifier that's doing the streaming. Your device is just acting as a controller, as opposed to Bluetooth where your device is tied up in streaming duties as well. And being Google, it supports all the usual culprits when it comes to streaming services: Spotify, Tidal, Cobus, Roon, and a whole bunch of others. It's an excellent feature. So let's talk about sound quality. Now I'm going to talk about the amplifier first as a standalone unit. I'll mention the sound quality of the DAC and the streamer at the end. The NAD C338 as a pure amplifier I would describe as a safe pair of hands at this price point. It's a good sounding amplifier across the board. It does everything reasonably well, nothing badly, nothing exceptionally good for that matter either. The overall tonal characteristic is slightly on the warm side of neutral, and the presentation is a touch mid-centric. So I'll break this down in a little bit more detail, starting with the low end frequencies first. The bass has good extension, it has good weight, it doesn't hit as hard, isn't as fast as dynamic as the IOTA VX SA3. The IOTA is superior in that regard. As far as the mid-range frequencies are concerned, in the lower mid-range, the NAD is full sounding, the IOTA is slightly lean. That's where the warmth of the NAD comes through in that lower mid-range. It's good for male vocals as well, female vocals to some extent. The IOTA is ever so lean in that regard, as I mentioned. The mid-range overall, both amplifiers have good resolution, detail, separation between instruments at this price point. The IOTA is slightly cleaner in the way it produces leading edges of notes. They're a touch softer on the NAD in comparison. In the upper mid-range, now this is a critical frequency around the 2.5 to 5K range because it's associated with bright and harsh sounds, and they're both fine. Both these amplifiers are what you'd expect at this price point. Now, if you feel I'm being a little reserved, the reason is that solid state amplifiers at this price point do have a slightly metallic, steely quality, and that's true of the NAD, it's true of the IOTA as well, and it's something that I'm particularly partial to, but you're going to find that amplifiers at this price point, it's only when you're looking at amplifiers considerably more that refinement comes in. In terms of high frequencies, the IOTA's a touch on the lively side. I won't say it's bright, but a touch on the lively side at high frequencies, and the NAD in comparison is a touch rolled off. The Project Maya S2 that I reviewed a couple of weeks ago is spot on in the middle of these two amplifiers. The overall tonal balance of the NAD is quite a classic British sound. Good extension in the bass, perhaps not the last word in terms of tightness and definition, a touch mid-centric in the mid-range, and a little rolled off at the top end. As far as the streamer is concerned, there's a slight degradation in the sound when listening through the streamer and the Google Chromecast compared to my Auralic Aries Mini. Slight hardening of the sound, but it wasn't particularly significant, and it wouldn't be something that I would be concerned about at this particular price point. Now, DACs built into amplifiers around this price point, where do I start? What I mean is I quite often have issues with inbuilt DACs around this £500–600 price point, sometimes even above this price point. I understand why they're there. They're there for convenience. In order to sell products these days, everybody wants the convenience of a one-box solution, hence the inbuilt DAC, phono stage, etc. But quite often they have a significant degrading effect on the sound. Now, that's probably harsh to say that's the case with the IOTA VX SA3, but it is to some extent. The DAC does not live up to the quality of the amplifier. It's not the case with the NAD. The Cirrus Logic CS4382 DAC does not degrade the sound. I tried external DACs like my Mojo and Audiolab DAC that I had, and they didn't offer a benefit in terms of sonic performance. Not because they're not better DACs, it's just that the DAC in the Cirrus lived up to the quality of the amplifier, and the amplifier was the bottleneck, not the DAC. So I don't think you're going to need to replace the DAC inside the NAD C338 until you replace the amplifier. It's a good, clean sounding DAC. So what kind of setup and speakers is this amplifier appropriate to use with? Well, if you've got a large room with inefficient speakers, this isn't the amplifier for you. There's only 50 watts per channel on offer here. But if you've got small to medium-sized rooms with moderately efficient speakers, you're going to be absolutely fine. What do I mean by moderately efficient? Something with a sensitivity rating in the high 80s. If you don't listen particularly loud, you might get away with mid-80s sensitivity rating. This is a Class D amplifier. Now, Class D amplifiers are quite good at driving tricky speakers that have low impedance dips in their response. According to NAD, this amplifier can momentarily drive a 1 ohm impedance load and deliver 18 amps of current, which is quite a bit, but only momentarily. The likelihood it's going to be paired with speakers that aren't going to go anywhere near that low. So I don't think you're going to have much of a problem driving speakers that are typically going to be associated with amplifiers around this price point. I tried it with a bunch of speakers. I tried it with my ProAct Response 1 SEs, it drove them fine. But the ProAct 1 SEs, to get them singing, do like amplifiers with quite a bit of power and control. And I did feel that the NAD lacked the control and power to get them ultimately singing. And it was a similar case with the ATC SCM7s that I have here also for review. I also tried it with the Triangle Genez Trios that you see behind me. That's a much easier speaker to drive. It has a 90 dB sensitivity rating and the minimum dip in its impedance is only 4.4 ohms, so it's relatively easy to drive. It drove it really well, had nice grip and control, and they were quite a nice balance actually tonally as well. I won't say too much because the review of the Trios is still pending. I also tried it with my PSB Imagine Minis. They're a tiny little mini monitor, and the reason I tried that is PSB is from the same stable as NAD, and I thought they may work well together as a house sound, and they did. The PSBs are slightly lean and clean and analytical in nature, and the full warm sound of the NAD married those up quite nicely, and they were a very good match. So I think the kind of speakers I would personally choose with this amplifier would be on the slightly dry, clean, analytical side of neutral to balance the characteristics of the amplifier. So let's wrap things up. Now, if I'm totally honest, if I was just evaluating the NAD C338 as an amplifier, it'd get a recommended from this channel. It's a good sounding amplifier at its price point, but nothing exceptional. But what you have to take into account is that it has a DAC built in. And what's the big deal there? Lots of amplifiers at this price point have a DAC built in. Most of them do not have DACs of this quality. The DAC, as I mentioned in the review, does not degrade the sound quality of this amplifier. I don't think you're going to have to replace it for as long as you have this amplifier. The value proposition goes up. The other thing it has is a streamer built in. Very easy to use streamer with good functionality, supporting a lot of apps. You've got to ask yourself what you're going to go out and spend on a streamer. It's going to be 100 and 150 pounds for a basic streamer at least. And again, the streamer doesn't significantly degrade the sound quality of this amplifier. I think the vast majority of people will be quite happy living with that streamer and not need to upgrade it. Again, the value proposition goes up. As an overall package, I think the NAD C338 is very good value for money at its price point at £600, and it gets a highly recommended from this channel for that particular reason. So hopefully you've liked this review. If you have, please hit that like button, please share it. For those of you who haven't subscribed already, if you like my approach to hi-fi, please consider subscribing. But for today, for now, a British Audiophile signing off.